In looking at shipwrecks, you will mostly see the intact wrecks, ships like Hornet or Bismarck, which are still clearly recognizable. This even applies to cases like Titanic, where the bow has been studied in detail, while the wreck's stern has barely been covered by comparison. Some wrecks, however, are interesting because they're completely destroyed. These wrecks show the power of their destruction, but because of that violent end, they aren't covered as much. This weekend's video is one such example. Today we will be looking at USS Strong. This destroyer, the victim of one of the longest range torpedo hits in history, is a mess. And I don't use that word lightly either. If you watched the video on Shimakaze and thought that was bad, well, Strong is far worse. I'll still go over this in as much detail as I can, but a lot of it is going to be scattered debris. Before that, however, the traditional overview of the sinking. That came, in Strong's case, on July 5th, 1943. The Fletcher-class destroyer was operating in support of landings on New Georgia in the Solomon Islands, specifically the landings at Rice Anchorage and Kula Gulf. If the latter name sounds familiar, it probably should, because on the early morning of July 6th, USS Helena was sunk in the Battle of Kula Gulf. As for Strong, she joined fellow destroyers Chevalier and Nicholas in scouting ahead of the main landing force. Around 12:30 a.m. on July 5th, the destroyers closed in on the harbor to shell it. All well and good, but 9 minutes after they began the shelling, a torpedo came out of nowhere and slammed into Strong's port side. That was a long lance fired by the Japanese destroyer Nizuki, from an estimated distance of 20 kilometers or 13 miles. This is generally seen as the longest range torpedo hit in history, and it's the rare case where the extreme range of the long lance actually made a real difference. Those were generally thrown around at a much closer range. Regardless, Strong was doomed by that torpedo. At first, the damage was limited to a 15 to 20 degree list. While Strong's crew fought to save their ship, USS O'Bannon fired on shore batteries to keep the Japanese from taking advantage. USS Chevalier, meanwhile, proved that tin-can heroism wasn't limited to the famous ships. Her captain, Commander Ephraim McLean Jr., rammed his ship into Strong's bow. He did this rather insane maneuver so that lines and nets could be thrown over to get men off Strong. The order to abandon ship came soon after the two destroyers were pushed together. With Chevalier's action, 234 sailors and 7 officers were evacuated in around 7 minutes. That was 3/4 of the entire crew. Unfortunately, the rest of the crew couldn't be rescued. Shore batteries zoned in on the two destroyers in spite of O'Bannon's fire. Chevalier had to cast off, with 1/4 of the crew still aboard Strong or floating in the water. The destroyer's lists continued to increase, reaching as much as 60 degrees before USS Strong ultimately broke in half, probably where the torpedo had hit the ship, around the number 1 fire room. As the ship broke in two and sank, Strong's depth charges detonated. This explosion was strong enough to knock Chevalier's radar and sonar out of action. It is also likely responsible for the condition of the wreck today. In any event, 46 of Strong's crew went down with their ship. At that point, her story came to an end until fairly recently. The wreck would only be discovered in February of 2019 on one of RV Petrel's last expeditions. They found Strong in pieces on the bottom, around 300 meters or 980 feet down. The relatively shallow depth also did not do this wreck any favors, as we'll see. The severe damage was met by severe corrosion without the preservation of deep waters. Keep that in mind as we look at what little remains of USS Strong. Now, normally I would break this up by hull, weaponry, and debris field. In the case of Strong, there's not really a hull to look at. So I'll begin with the weaponry, and then look at the debris that used to be a destroyer. First, we have the remnants of one of the 5-inch guns. As a Fletcher-class destroyer, Strong carried 5 such weapons. This is actually the more intact of the 2 that Petrel photographed, for a certain value of intact. Much of the gunhouse is completely gone, with only a bit of the side and bottom remaining, and the barrel seems to be slightly tilted to the side. While the corrosion has eroded much of the detail, you can see the breach mechanism of the mount. I'll put an arrow towards that. According to Petrel, this was the number 1 gun. However, what little you can make out of the hull doesn't really give much detail. I'll put another arrow to where you can see scattered wreckage, but there's not really much to make out in this area. Unfortunately, there's even less to speak of with the second mount. Petrel says this is the other forward gun, the number 2 one. However, this is in even worse condition. The mount fell off the ship and landed upside down, with the barrel falling out. The entire gunhouse seems to be gone this time as well, other than the base, visible here at the top. There's also what looks like a sighting port, but it's hard to make out for sure. Past that, just a bunch of ruined metal that speaks to the violence of the sinking. No sign of the hull here at all. So, let's move on to the torpedoes with the next picture. Here we have the one launcher that Petrel photographed. Strong would have carried 2 quintuple mounts, both amidships. As for this set of tubes, it seems to have been crushed by some debris. What kind of debris I can't say for sure, because it's so broken and torn up. I can see what looks like some wiring shown here. There also seems to be some of the decking visible beneath the tubes, but there's no visible structure around it. As for the mount itself, it's rusted and covered in sea life. Much of the detail is lost at this point, other than the equipment on the top, and the very fuzzy back of the tubes as well. Since that is the back of the mount, I can't say if the torpedoes are still inside their tubes, or if they fell out. If they are there, they're buried beneath the wreckage, which is still better than the other set, which seems to be outright missing. Aside from this, a protective covering in the debris field, probably the blast shield for the aft torpedo mount. It's sitting on its own, with maybe some ruined deck sitting around it. No sign of the tubes or torpedoes themselves. That rounds off the weaponry, such as it is, so let's move on to the debris. Beginning with what is, apparently, the remnants of the bow. Not that you'd be able to tell that easily, because it's just a pile of rusty metal. The only recognizable bit is the anchor chain and its mounting, shown here. Other than that, there's nothing that really sticks out as the bow of the ship. No deck, no angled bow slicing into the darkness. The next picture, meanwhile, defies the trend. Mostly. This is the bridge, which is mostly recognizable. It still broke away from the ship, but other than that, it's remarkably intact. You can see the round windows of the pilot house here. And here you have the base of the rangefinder. Both of these are still identifiable, in spite of the general state of this wreck. I'd go so far as to say the bridge is the part in the best condition on Strong's wreck, which is interesting in of itself because it's usually the reverse. If the bridge fell away, it's often in pretty bad shape compared to the rest of the wreck. With the next picture, however, we return to nearly unrecognizable wreckage. Petrel listed it as a boiler, but it could also be something else, like one of the condensers or a feed water heater, or the engine lube oil cooler. Frankly, it's very difficult to say with any certainty. Most of the machinery is buried beneath debris. If someone can identify what this is in the comments, by all means go ahead. I'm actually curious myself because it's so hard to make out details. Moving on from big debris to small debris, we have a picture of some wreckage, with what appears to be a helmet right in front of it. That would be a reminder of the human cost of these sinkings, like similar sights on larger wrecks. As for the next 2 pictures, those are a matching set, one further out and one closer in. Here we have more of the wreckage, including what might be part of the mast, and in front of that, some form of unexploded ordnance. It doesn't seem to be a 5-inch shell. Petrel noted it as the front of a torpedo, which, looking at pictures of Mark 15 torpedoes, does seem fairly likely. Most likely the rest of the torpedo fell apart during or after the sinking, leaving the warhead to fall down on its own. The rest of the debris, meanwhile, continues the theme of torn apart and barely recognizable in the background. There's 2 distinct pieces, shown here and here, but I can't make out what they actually are. The second picture, for its part, is simply a close-up look at that apparent torpedo warhead. From this distance, the comparison to the Mark 15 is even more apparent. With that done, we come to the last picture of the wreck. One of the ship's propellers, or screws, sitting all on its own. It broke from the shaft and fell to the bottom, embedding itself in the mud. This is, on its own, an interesting picture. You don't often see something like this. In context of this wreck, it's just a final reminder of how badly Strong was torn apart. This was not a ship that went quietly, not at all. It's too bad that she is, relatively, obscure in the modern day. Hopefully this video does at least a little to bring her story back into the light. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.